What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world shattered your heart into a million pieces, and you discovered you were carrying their child the very next day? Would you fight for what you thought was love, or would you disappear into the shadows to protect both yourself and your unborn baby? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old marketing executive who thought she had found her forever person in David Chun, a successful architect who seemed to check every box on her list. Their 3-year relationship was the kind that made friends jealous and families hopeful for wedding bells. But sometimes, the people we think we know best are complete strangers wearing familiar faces. What Sarah discovered about David on that rainy Tuesday evening in October didn't just break her heart. It shattered her entire understanding of who she was and what she deserved. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, that it made her question every moment they had shared together. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and the pregnancy test she took the morning after walking away from David would set in motion a chain of events so extraordinary that even she couldn't have imagined them. This isn't just another story about infidelity and broken hearts. This is a story about resilience, unexpected allies, shocking discoveries, and the kind of plot twists that make you realize truth really is stranger than fiction. By the time you finish reading Sarah's journey, you'll understand why sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most incredible transformations, and why walking away from the wrong person can lead you straight into the arms of a destiny you never saw coming. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that trust was like a glass sculpture, beautiful, precious, and impossible to repair once broken. She just never imagined that the person holding the hammer would be the man she planned to marry. The rain drummed against her apartment windows as she stared at her laptop screen, reading the same email for the 5th time. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through months of correspondence between David and someone named Rebecca Martinez. The messages weren't just friendly, they were intimate, passionate, and dated back almost 18 months. 18 months of lies, 18 months of I love yous, whispered to 2 different women, 18 months of living a complete fraud. Sarah's discovery had been accidental, like most devastating revelations. David had left his laptop open when he rushed out to handle what he called a work emergency at 7 that morning. She had only meant to check her own email using his computer since her phone was dead and her charger was in her car. But when she opened the browser, his Gmail was still logged in, and the latest message from Rebecca was right there in bold letters. Can't wait for our weekend getaway, my love. The cabin you booked looks perfect for our anniversary. Their anniversary. Sarah felt sick. What anniversary? She and David were celebrating their 3-year anniversary next month. Her mind raced as she clicked through the email thread, each message feeling like a physical blow. Rebecca wasn't just some random fling. She was David's girlfriend of 2 years. His serious girlfriend. His other girlfriend. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that mirrored her own in terrifying detail. David took Rebecca to the same restaurants, bought her similar jewelry, even used the same pet names. He had told Rebecca the same stories about his childhood, shared the same dreams about the future. It was as if he was living the same life twice, with 2 different women who had no idea the other existed. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from David. Emergency at the Johnson Project site. We'll be late tonight. Love you. She stared at the message, knowing now that it was probably a lie. Another lie in a web of lies that had apparently been spinning for over a year and a half. She screenshot the text and then opened the email thread again, looking for any mention of Johnson Project. There wasn't one. Instead, she found an email from 3 hours ago where David told Rebecca he would pick her up at 8 for their dinner reservation at Chez Laurent, the same restaurant where he had taken Sarah for her birthday last month. The numbness was the worst part. Sarah had always imagined that if something like this happened, she would scream, cry, throw things. Instead, she felt hollow, as if someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out everything that made her who she was. She sat in his apartment, their apartment, since she had practically moved in 6 months ago, surrounded by the life they had built together, and felt like a stranger in her own skin. She started noticing things she had somehow missed before. The way David always turned his phone face down when they were together. The business trips that seemed to happen every other weekend. The fact that she had never met his extended family, even though they had been together for 3 years. He always had excuses. His family lived far away. He was a private person. Work was demanding. Sarah had accepted these explanations because she loved him, because she trusted him, because she wanted to believe that their relationship was as perfect as it seemed on the surface. But now she saw the truth. She wasn't his girlfriend. She was his other girlfriend. And from the looks of the emails, Rebecca probably thought she was the only one too. Sarah spent the next 4 hours going through every email, every photo, every document on David's laptop. What she found destroyed any remaining hope that this was just an affair, a mistake, something they could work through. David wasn't just cheating. He was living a double life so elaborate and well-orchestrated that it must have taken incredible planning and energy to maintain. He had 2 different social media accounts under slightly different names, 2 different group of friends who never overlapped, 2 different gym memberships in different parts of the city. He even had 2 different versions of his resume, each emphasizing different aspects of his career depending on which woman he was trying to impress. Sarah realized that she didn't know David at all. The man she loved, the man she had imagined spending the rest of her life with, was a complete fabrication. The worst part was finding photos of Rebecca. She was beautiful, accomplished, and, from her LinkedIn profile, worked as a senior financial analyst at a prestigious investment firm. In the photos David had taken of her, she looked radiant, completely in love, completely unaware that the man behind the camera was living the exact same life with someone else. Sarah saw herself in Rebecca's smile, in the way she looked at David, in the way she posed for pictures with the same landmarks and locations where Sarah had posed just weeks or months later. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to understand the scope of David's deception. This wasn't a man who had fallen into an affair. This was a man who had systematically constructed 2 separate relationships with the same level of commitment, planning, and emotional investment. He wasn't just unfaithful. He was living as 2 completely different people. She found evidence that he maintained separate apartments, though he spent most nights with either her or Rebecca depending on his work schedule. She discovered that he had been rotating weekends and holidays between them, always having a business excuse for why he couldn't spend certain occasions with one woman while he was actually with the other. The level of organization required for such deception was staggering and somehow made the betrayal feel even more calculated and cruel. By 5 o'clock, Sarah had made her decision. She wasn't going to confront David, wasn't going to give him a chance to explain or lie his way out of what she had discovered. She wasn't going to fight for a relationship that had never really existed in the first place. Instead, she was going to disappear from his life as completely and quietly as possible. She packed everything that belonged to her into 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. 3 years of her life fit into 5 containers. As she gathered her belongings, she realized how little of herself she had actually brought to David's space. Most of her furniture was still at her old apartment, which she had thankfully never given up completely. Her books, her art, her personal items. She had kept most of them separate, telling herself it was because she wanted to take things slow, but now she wondered if some part of her had sensed that this relationship wasn't as solid as it appeared. The hardest part was deciding whether to contact Reb. Sarah stared at the pregnancy test for what felt like hours, though the digital clock on her nightstand showed only 3 minutes had passed. The word pregnant glowed back at her in unmistakable letters, confirming what her body had been whispering for weeks and what her heart had been desperately trying to ignore. She was in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters of bands she had loved in high school and shelves full of books she had read a dozen times. The contrast between the innocent remnants of her teenage years and the life-altering reality she was facing felt surreal. Just 24 hours ago, she had thought her biggest problem was heartbreak. Now she was facing a decision that would affect not just her future, but the future of another human being. Her phone buzzed constantly with missed calls and texts from David. She had turned off the notifications after the first dozen messages, but the screen still lit up every few minutes with his attempts to reach her. She didn't read the texts. She couldn't afford to let his words confuse her or make her doubt what she had seen with her own eyes. But she knew he had discovered her note and was probably panicking about damage control. What David didn't know, what he could never know, was that the situation had just become infinitely more complicated. Sarah's parents had welcomed her home with the kind of unquestioning love that only parents can provide. They didn't ask for details about why she had shown up at their door at 11 o'clock at night with suitcases and red eyes. Her mother, Margaret, had simply made up the guest room and heated up leftover casserole while her father, Robert, carried her bags upstairs and pretended not to notice when she started crying again. "Whatever happened, sweetheart, you're home now," her mother had said, stroking Sarah's hair like she used to when Sarah was little and had nightmares. "We'll figure it out together." But how could they figure this out together when Sarah wasn't even sure what this was yet? She was pregnant, alone, and facing a future she had never imagined. The father of her child was a man who had lied to her about virtually every aspect of his life, a man she could never trust again, a man she had sworn never to contact again. Sarah spent the morning walking through her hometown, trying to process her new reality. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where high school classmates still lived within a few miles of their childhood homes, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual fall festival. It was exactly the kind of stable, predictable environment that felt comforting after the chaos of discovering David's betrayal. But it was also the kind of place where being pregnant and single would generate months of gossip and speculation. She found herself at the small park where she used to play as a child, sitting on the same swing set where she had once imagined her future. Back then, her dreams had been simple: graduate from college, find a job she loved, marry a good man, have children, live happily ever after. She had checked off the first two items on that list with relative ease. She had thought she was well on her way to achieving the third. Now she was facing the possibility of the fourth item happening in a way she had never anticipated. The rational part of Sarah's mind began working through her options. She could raise the child alone. She had a good job, supportive parents, and enough savings to manage for a while. She could contact David and tell him about the pregnancy. He was the father, and regardless of his lies, he had a right to know. She could consider other options, though the moment she thought about them, she knew they weren't for her. But underneath the practical considerations was a deeper, more emotional question. What kind of man was David really? The David she had fallen in love with would have been thrilled about a pregnancy, would have immediately started talking about nursery colors and baby names and the kind of father he wanted to be. But that David had been a fiction, a character carefully constructed to win her love and trust. The real David was a man capable of maintaining elaborate lies for years, a man who had no trouble deceiving two women simultaneously. What would the real David do if he knew about the pregnancy? Would he use it as leverage to try to win her back? Would he deny responsibility? Would he demand involvement in the child's life while continuing to live his double life? The uncertainty was almost as frightening as the pregnancy itself. Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from her best friend, Jessica, who lived back in the city. Sarah hesitated before answering, knowing that Jessica would want details about the sudden departure and might have insights about David's behavior that Sarah wasn't ready to hear. "Sarah, thank God," Jessica said as soon as Sarah picked up. "I've been worried sick. Your neighbor said you moved out yesterday, and David called me 3 times looking for you. What happened?" Sarah found herself telling the whole story: the discovered emails, the double life, the elaborate deception. Jessica listened in shocked silence, occasionally gasping or muttering curse words under her breath. "I knew something was off about him," Jessica said when Sarah finished. "I could never put my finger on it, but there were little things, like how he never wanted to go to group events, or how he was always vague about his schedule. And remember how he never posted pictures of you guys on social media? He said he was private, but now it makes sense." "I feel so stupid," Sarah admitted. "How did I miss all the signs?" "You missed them because you trusted him," Jessica replied firmly. "That's not stupid. That's what people do when they're in love. He's the one who chose to abuse that trust. This is not your fault." Sarah almost told Jessica about the pregnancy then, but something held her back. Once she said it out loud to someone else, it would become real in a way that even the positive pregnancy test hadn't made it. She wasn't ready for other people's opinions or advice about what she should do. She needed more time to process this on her own. After hanging up with Jessica, Sarah walked back to her parents' house and found them sitting at the kitchen table, clearly waiting for her return. They had obviously been discussing her situation, trying to figure out how to help without overstepping. "Sit down, honey," her mother said, pouring Sarah a cup of tea. "Your father and I have been talking, and we want you to know that whatever's going on, whatever you need, we're here for you. If you want to stay here for a while, you're welcome to. If you need help getting back on your feet, we'll do whatever we can." Sarah looked at her parents, her father with his graying hair and kind eyes, her mother with her gentle smile and nurturing nature, and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. They were good people who had raised her to believe in honesty, commitment, and the importance of family. How would they react when she told them she was pregnant by a man who had betrayed her, a man they had never even met? "Mom, Dad," Sarah began, her voice shaky. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something that makes this whole situation more complicated." She saw them both tense slightly, preparing themselves for whatever revelation was coming. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Sarah watched her parents' faces, seeing surprise, concern, and a dozen other emotions flicker across their features as they processed this news. Finally, her father reached across the table and took her hand. "How do you feel about it?" he asked simply. The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected judgment, questions about her plans, lectures about responsibility. Instead, her father was asking about her feelings, giving her space to process this development without immediately demanding solutions. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Scared, overwhelmed, but also," she paused, surprised by her own response. "Also kind of excited. I've always wanted children, just not like this. Not alone." 2 weeks after Sarah disappeared from David's life, Rebecca Martinez was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, staring at an envelope that had arrived at her office that morning. The handwriting was feminine, unfamiliar, and something about the weight of the envelope suggested it contained more than just a simple letter. Rebecca had been having doubts about David for months. Little inconsistencies in his stories, unexplained gaps in his schedule, the way he sometimes seemed to forget conversations they had supposedly had together. She had attributed these concerns to her own paranoia. Her ex-fiancé had cheated on her 2 years earlier, and she knew she was probably being overly suspicious as a result. But the envelope in front of her suggested that her suspicions might not have been paranoia after all. With trembling fingers, Rebecca opened the envelope and pulled out printed emails, screenshots of social media profiles, and a short handwritten note that simply said, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. He's been lying to both of us." As Rebecca read through the evidence, her world crumbled in a way that felt familiar and devastating. The emails were between David and someone whose name appeared to be Sarah. Intimate messages that spanned over a year, messages that referenced anniversaries, shared memories, and future plans that directly contradicted everything David had told her about his life. But what shocked Rebecca even more than the evidence of David's infidelity was the realization that his lies to her had been far more elaborate than simple cheating. According to these documents, David had told Sarah he was an architect who specialized in sustainable design. He had told Rebecca he was a construction project manager who was working his way up to starting his own company. The resumes she found showed 2 completely different career trajectories, different educational backgrounds, even different professional references. Rebecca pulled out her phone and started cross-referencing the information in the documents with what she knew about David. The more she investigated, the more confused she became. The David Chun she had been dating for 2 years claimed to have grown up in Portland, Oregon, and attended Oregon State University. But the David Chun in these documents had apparently told Sarah he was from Sacramento, California, and had graduated from UC Davis. Feeling sick and increasingly paranoid, Rebecca drove to David's apartment, the apartment she had helped him decorate, where she had spent countless nights, where she kept a drawer full of her own clothes. She used the key he had given her 6 months earlier to let herself in, her heart pounding as she began searching for evidence of the other life he had apparently been living. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Hidden in the back of David's closet, behind winter coats and boxes of old paperwork, Rebecca discovered a second cell phone, a second laptop, and a folder full of documents that made her question everything she thought she knew about the man she had fallen in love with. The second phone contained text messages with Sarah that dated back almost 3 years, which meant David had been with Sarah longer than he had been with Rebecca. The messages revealed a relationship that was serious, committed, and completely incompatible with the timeline David had given Rebecca about his dating history. According to what he had told Rebecca, he had been single for 6 months before they met. According to these messages, he had been in a serious relationship with Sarah for over a year when he and Rebecca first started dating. But the documents in the folder revealed something even more disturbing. Rebecca found multiple driver's licenses with David's photo, but different names: David Chun, David Chong, and David Murphy. She found social security cards, credit cards, and even a passport under the name David Murphy that showed a completely different place of birth than any of the stories he had told her. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she photographed everything she found. This wasn't just infidelity. This was identity fraud on a massive scale. The man she had been dating didn't just have another girlfriend. He appeared to have multiple complete identities, possibly multiple complete lives. Her first instinct was to call the police, but something held her back. She needed to understand the scope of what she had discovered before involving law enforcement. More importantly, she needed to contact Sarah, the woman who had apparently tried to warn her about David's lies. Rebecca spent the next hour going through David's computer, finding evidence of bank accounts under different names, rental agreements for apartments she had never seen, and email accounts she had never known existed. The picture that emerged was of a man who had constructed multiple parallel lives with the same methodical precision that other people use to organize their schedules or manage their finances. She found flight records showing trips to cities David had never mentioned visiting. She found receipts for expensive dinners at restaurants during times when he had told her he was working late. Most disturbing of all, she found what appeared to be surveillance photos of herself and Sarah. Photos taken from a distance, without their knowledge, stored in folders labeled with their names, and containing detailed notes about their schedules, preferences, and routines. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that David hadn't just been lying to them. He had been studying them, tracking them, treating their relationships like some kind of elaborate social experiment or manipulation game. Her phone buzzed with a call from David. She stared at his name on the screen, wondering if she should answer, wondering if she should confront him about what she had found. Instead, she let it go to voicemail and continued searching through his things. In the very back of his desk drawer, Rebecca found a business card that made her blood run cold. Marcus Webb, private investigator, specializing in background verification and identity confirmation. Written on the back of the card in David's handwriting were the names Sarah Mitchell and Rebecca Martinez, along with what appeared to be their social security numbers and dates of birth. Rebecca photographed the card and immediately searched for Marcus Webb online. His website showed a professional-looking operation that specialized in helping people verify the identities of romantic partners, potential employees, and business associates. But what caught Rebecca's attention was a testimonial on the website from someone identified only as DC, who praised Webb for helping him maintain operational security while building meaningful relationships. The language of the testimonial was strange, almost clinical. It didn't sound like someone describing a normal background check. It sounded like someone describing a covert operation. Rebecca called the number on Webb's card from David's apartment phone, hoping to get information without revealing her own identity. Webb Investigations, a gravelly voice answered after 3 rings. "Hi, I'm calling about David Chun," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand you've done some work for him." There was a long pause. "Who is this?" "I'm a friend of his. He mentioned that you had helped him with some background checks, and I was interested in similar services." "David Chun," Webb repeated slowly. "You mean David Murphy?" Rebecca's heart stopped. "I'm sorry, your friend David. His real name is David Murphy. Chun is just one of his working identities. Look, lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but if you're really a friend of Murphy's, you should know better than to use that name over the phone." Webb hung up before Rebecca could ask any more questions, but she had heard enough. David wasn't just using multiple identities. He was working with a professional investigator who apparently knew about his deception and was helping him maintain it. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon researching David Murphy online. What she found was sparse but troubling. There was a David Murphy who had been arrested in Nevada 3 years earlier for identity theft and fraud, but the charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. There was another David Murphy who had been involved in a lawsuit over a real estate scam in Arizona, though the case had been settled out of court. She couldn't find any clear photos of these other David Murphys, and the details were vague enough that she couldn't be certain they were the same person as the David she knew. But the pattern was becoming clear. David, whatever his real name was, had a history of deception that went far beyond simple infidelity. As evening approached, Rebecca made a decision. She needed to contact Sarah, the woman who had sent her the warning. Sarah might not know the full scope of what they were dealing with, but she clearly knew enough to recognize that David was dangerous. Rebecca found Sarah's contact information in David's phone and composed a careful email. "Sarah, thank you for the envelope you sent. I found much more than just evidence of cheating. I think we're both in danger, and I think David might not be who either of us thought he was. Can we talk?" She sent the email and then sat in David's apartment, surrounded by evidence of his lies, waiting for a response and wondering how she had fallen in love with a man who might not even exist. What Rebecca didn't know was that 300 miles away, Sarah was sitting in a doctor's office, getting an ultrasound that would reveal not just the confirmation of her pregnancy, but something else that would make David's deception seem even more significant. The baby Sarah was carrying had a rare genetic condition that would require ongoing medical monitoring and treatment. Nothing life-threatening, but something that would definitely show up in routine genetic testing. Something that might be traceable. Something that might provide the key to figuring out who David really was and why he had constructed such an elaborate web of lies around two women who had never done anything to deserve such deception. Sarah read Rebecca's email 3 times before fully absorbing what it meant. The woman David had been deceiving alongside her was reaching out, claiming there was more to discover, suggesting they were both in danger. Sarah's first instinct was to delete the email and pretend she had never received it. She had walked away from David's lies for a reason, and getting pulled back into his web of deception was the last thing she wanted while dealing with her pregnancy. But something about Rebecca's message nagged at her. The phrase, "David might not be who either of us thought he was," suggested discoveries that went beyond simple infidelity. Against her better judgment, Sarah picked up the phone and called the number Rebecca had included in her email. "Sarah?" Rebecca's voice was tense, almost fearful. "I got your email," Sarah said carefully. "What do you mean we're in danger? Can we meet in person? I don't think this is safe to discuss over the phone." Sarah hesitated. Meeting Rebecca felt too much like getting involved in David's drama again, and she had promised herself she was done with anything connected to him. But the fear in Rebecca's voice was genuine, and if there really was some kind of danger, Sarah needed to know about it, especially now that she was pregnant. "I'm not in the city anymore," Sarah said. "I'm staying with my parents in Millbrook, about 3 hours south. Can you come here?" "I'll drive down tomorrow," Rebecca replied immediately. "Sarah, I found things in David's apartment that I think he's been lying about more than just having 2 girlfriends. I think his whole identity might be fake." After hanging up, Sarah spent a sleepless night wondering what Rebecca had discovered and whether she was making a mistake by getting involved. Part of her wanted to call Rebecca back and cancel their meeting. But the larger part of her, the part that was growing increasingly concerned about what David might be capable of, knew she needed to hear what Rebecca had found. Rebecca arrived in Millbrook the next afternoon, driving a rental car and looking like she hadn't slept much either. Sarah met her at a small cafe on Main Street, choosing a public place where they could talk freely but safely. When Rebecca walked in, Sarah was struck by how similar they looked. Both brunette, both professional, both clearly intelligent women who should have been able to spot a fraud from a mile away. "Thank you for meeting me," Rebecca said, sliding into the booth across from Sarah. "I know this is awkward." "That's an understatement," Sarah replied, studying the woman who had unknowingly shared a boyfriend with her for over a year. "What did you find?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed Sarah the photos she had taken in David's apartment. As Sarah scrolled through images of multiple IDs, surveillance photos, and business cards for private investigators, she felt the same sick feeling she had experienced when first discovering David's emails. "The investigator I called thinks David's real name might be David Murphy," Rebecca explained. "And When I researched that name, I found possible connections to identity theft and fraud cases in other states. Sarah stared at a photo of driver's licenses showing David's face with 3 different names. Who is he really? I don't think either of us knows, Rebecca admitted. But I think we need to find out. Especially since. She paused, seeming to struggle with something. Sarah, I found surveillance photos of both of us in his apartment. Photos taken without our knowledge, with notes about our schedules and routines. This goes way beyond cheating. Sarah felt a chill run through her. The idea that David had been watching her, documenting her life without her knowledge, made every memory of their relationship feel sinister and violated. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone except my parents. Rebecca waited, sensing the importance of whatever Sarah was about to reveal. I'm pregnant. With David's baby. Rebecca's eyes widened. Oh my God. Sarah, if David isn't who he says he is, if he's involved in some kind of criminal activity, then my child is connected to it, Sarah finished. That's what I've been thinking about all night. The 2 women sat in silence for a moment, both processing the implications of what they had discovered. Finally, Rebecca spoke. We need to go to the police. This is beyond what we can handle ourselves. With what evidence? Sarah asked. Photos of fake IDs that we obtained by breaking into his apartment? A conversation with a private investigator who might be complicit in whatever David is doing? We need more concrete proof before we involve law enforcement. Rebecca leaned forward. I might know how to get it. The private investigator, Marcus Webb, seemed to think I was working with David when I called him. If I could arrange to meet with him, maybe I could get him to reveal more about what they've been doing. That sounds dangerous, Sarah said. But she could see the logic in Rebecca's suggestion. Not if we do it right. If we record the conversation, if we meet in a public place, if we have backup nearby. Sarah found herself agreeing to a plan she knew was probably foolish. But the alternative, waiting and hoping that David's lies didn't somehow catch up with her and her unborn child, felt even more dangerous. They spent the next 2 hours planning their approach. Rebecca would contact Webb and arrange a meeting, claiming that David had asked her to take over some aspect of their arrangement. Sarah would accompany her but stay out of sight, providing backup and recording the conversation from a distance. What neither woman anticipated was that their investigation would uncover something far more shocking than identity theft or fraud. When Rebecca called Marcus Webb that evening and arranged to meet him the following day, she unknowingly set in motion a revelation that would change both their lives forever. Webb agreed to meet Rebecca at a diner outside the city, a location that seemed perfect for their purposes, public enough to be safe, isolated enough for private conversation. What they didn't know was that Webb had immediately called someone after hanging up with Rebecca, someone who was very interested in the fact that David Chin's girlfriends were investigating his background. The next morning, Sarah and Rebecca drove to the diner separately, with Rebecca arriving first and Sarah positioning herself at a table across the restaurant with a clear view of Rebecca's booth. Sarah used her phone to record audio while Rebecca wore a small recording device they had purchased at an electronics store. Webb arrived exactly on time. A graying man in his 50s who looked like he had spent too many years dealing with other people's secrets. He slid into the booth across from Rebecca and immediately got to business. So David sent you to clean up his mess, Webb said without preamble. About time. His operation was getting sloppy. Operation? Rebecca asked, trying to sound like she knew what he was talking about. Don't play dumb. The identity management program. The long-term deep cover assignments. David was supposed to maintain his covers for at least 5 years before extraction, but apparently he got careless. Rebecca felt her heart racing. Remind me of the specific parameters of his assignment? Webb looked at her suspiciously, but continued. Asset placement and intelligence gathering through romantic infiltration. David was assigned to monitor Sarah Mitchell and Rebecca Martinez as part of the broader financial sector surveillance program. Mitchell works for Morrison Marketing, which handles accounts for several defense contractors. Martinez is a senior analyst at Henley Financial, which processes transactions for government agencies. Sarah, listening from across the restaurant, felt the world tilt around her. David hadn't just been cheating on them. He had been assigned to spy on them as part of some kind of government operation. The problem, Webb continued, is that David apparently developed actual feelings for his targets, which compromised his objectivity. And now that they've discovered his dual identity, the whole operation is blown. What happens now? Rebecca asked, her voice barely steady. Extraction and reassignment. David gets a new identity and new targets. The women get monitored to ensure they don't expose the program. Standard protocol for blown covers. Monitored how? Rebecca pressed. Webb's expression darkened. That's not your concern. Your job is to help David disappear cleanly. His handlers are already arranging the extraction. At that moment, Sarah realized they were in immediate danger. If David was being extracted and she and Rebecca were being monitored, their investigation had just painted targets on their backs. She quickly texted Rebecca, "Get out now? This is bigger than we thought." Rebecca received the message and stood up abruptly. "I need to make a phone call," she told Webb, and walked quickly toward the exit. Webb's eyes followed her suspiciously, and Sarah saw him pull out his phone as Rebecca left the diner. Sarah waited 30 seconds before following, her mind racing as she processed what they had learned. David wasn't just a con artist or identity thief. He was some kind of government operative who had been assigned to spy on her and Rebecca through romantic relationships. The pregnancy she was carrying was with a man whose entire relationship with her had been a professional deception. Sarah and Rebecca met in the parking lot, both shaken by what they had discovered. "We need to disappear," Rebecca said immediately. "If they're planning to monitor us, if this is some kind of government program." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked. "If they're government operatives, they have resources we can't imagine." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of a small cabin in rural Montana, her hand resting on her now prominent belly as she watched the sunrise through frost-covered windows. The baby was due in just 2 months, and despite everything that had happened, she felt more at peace than she had in years. The journey to this moment had been anything but simple. After their terrifying discovery at the diner, Sarah and Rebecca had spent 3 weeks as modern-day fugitives, moving from safe house to safe house, while Rebecca's journalist friend, Patricia Hendricks, worked to verify their story and build a case that could protect them. Patricia had connections in the intelligence community and experience exposing government overreach, but even she had been shocked by the scope of what Sarah and Rebecca had uncovered. The program David had been part of was called Operation Domestic Insight, a classified initiative that used romantic infiltration to gather intelligence on American citizens who worked in sensitive industries. The targets weren't suspected of any wrongdoing. They were simply people with access to information that certain government agencies wanted to monitor. Patricia's investigation revealed that Operation Domestic Insight had been active for over a decade, with dozens of operatives maintaining long-term romantic relationships with unwitting targets across the country. Sarah and Rebecca were just 2 of many women who had unknowingly been dating government spies. But Sarah and Rebecca's case was different because of one crucial factor. Sarah was pregnant with the child of an operative, which created legal complications that the program's architects had never anticipated. The breakthrough came when Patricia connected with a former NSA contractor named Michael Torres, who had been trying to expose Operation Domestic Insight for years. Torres had worked on the program's technical infrastructure and had documented evidence of its illegal activities, but he had been unable to find victims willing to come forward. Sarah and Rebecca's willingness to testify, combined with Torres's technical evidence and Patricia's investigative reporting, created a perfect storm that the program couldn't weather. Within weeks of Patricia's first article being published, congressional hearings were announced, and the Department of Justice launched a formal investigation. David, whose real name turned out to be Daniel Morrison, was arrested along with 17 other operatives and 6 supervisors. The program was shut down, and its victims were offered protection and compensation through a classified settlement program. But, for Sarah, the resolution of the legal case was only the beginning of her real journey. Learning that her entire relationship with David had been a professional assignment had been devastating in ways that simple infidelity could never have been. Every memory, every intimate moment, every declaration of love had been part of an elaborate performance designed to gather intelligence about her work and personal life. The man she had fallen in love with had literally never existed. The pregnancy had complicated her emotional healing in unexpected ways. Part of her resented the child for being connected to such trauma and deception, but a larger part of her recognized that the baby was as much a victim of the program as she was. The child she was carrying had been conceived as part of a government operation, but it was still her child, still deserving of love and protection. Rebecca had become an unexpected source of support throughout the ordeal. The two women had bonded over their shared trauma in ways that transcended the awkwardness of their situation. Rebecca had even relocated to Montana to be closer to Sarah during the pregnancy, and they had developed a friendship that neither of them had expected. "Coffee's ready," Rebecca called from the living room, where she was working on her laptop. After the congressional testimony and media interviews, Rebecca had decided to career change, using her financial analysis skills to help Patricia's nonprofit organization investigate corporate and government corruption. Sarah poured herself a cup of decaffeinated coffee and joined Rebecca by the fireplace. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, adding to the sense of isolation and peace that had drawn Sarah to this remote location. "Any word from Patricia about the final settlement terms?" Sarah asked. "She thinks they'll finalize everything next week," Rebecca replied. "The compensation package should be enough to ensure you never have to work again if you don't want to. Plus full medical coverage for you and the baby, and ongoing security monitoring to make sure no one connected to the program tries to retaliate." Sarah nodded, still amazed by how her life had changed. The woman who had discovered her boyfriend's infidelity 6 months ago had become a key witness in a major intelligence scandal, and was now wealthy enough to raise her child anywhere in the world she chose. But, more importantly, she had discovered reserves of strength and resilience she never knew she possessed. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Sarah said, settling into her chair. "After the baby is born, after all the legal stuff is finally over, and I want to help other women who've been through similar experiences. Not just the other Operation Domestic Insight victims, but women who've been deceived or manipulated by men they trusted. I want to use my settlement money to start a foundation or support group or something." Rebecca smiled. "I think that's perfect. You could partner with Patricia's organization, maybe develop resources for women who suspect they're being manipulated or spied on." Sarah placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick in response to her touch. "I want this child to grow up knowing that even when terrible things happen, you can find ways to help other people and make something positive out of the experience." "What about Daniel?" Rebecca asked carefully. They rarely discussed David by his real name, but the question of his fate had been hanging over both of them throughout the legal proceedings. "He'll be in prison for at least 15 years, Sarah said. The prosecutors said his case was one of the worst because he maintained multiple simultaneous assignments and actually developed a documented history of becoming emotionally attached to his targets. Apparently, that made him both ineffective as an operative and more dangerous to the program's security." "Do you think he really developed feelings for us?" Rebecca asked. "Or was that just part of his manipulation?" Sarah had been asked this question by therapists, lawyers, and journalists dozens of times over the past 6 months. She had finally come to a conclusion that brought her peace. "I think he might have developed some kind of feelings," she said slowly. "But they were so mixed up with his professional objectives that even he probably couldn't tell the difference between genuine emotion and performance. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. He made a choice every single day to continue lying to us, to continue violating our privacy and autonomy. Whatever he felt doesn't excuse what he did." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Her own healing process had been different from Sarah's, partly because she didn't have a pregnancy connecting her to the experience, but also because her natural personality was more analytical and less emotional than Sarah's. "I got a letter from one of the other victims yesterday," Rebecca said. "A woman in Denver whose boyfriend was monitoring her because she worked for a defense contractor. She said reading our testimony gave her the courage to come forward with her own story. This was the part of their experience that Sarah found most meaningful. The way their willingness to expose what had happened to them was helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. The program had been larger and more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Congressional investigators were still uncovering cases, and new victims were coming forward every week. Some had been in relationships with operatives for over a decade, building entire lives around men who had been assigned to spy on them. Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from her parents, who had been her steady sources of support throughout the entire ordeal. After the initial shock of learning that their daughter's boyfriend had been a government spy, Robert and Margaret Mitchell had thrown themselves into protecting and supporting Sarah with the same fierce dedication they had shown when she was a child. "Hi, Mom," Sarah answered. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Margaret's voice was warm with concern and love. "Good. The baby's been active this morning, and the snow is beautiful here. Your father and I were thinking about driving up this weekend if you'd like the company." Sarah looked around the cabin that had become her refuge, simple, comfortable, and far enough from civilization that she felt truly safe for the first time since discovering David's emails. "I'd love that," she said. "Rebecca's making her famous lasagna, and we could use some help eating it." After hanging up with her parents, Sarah returned to the window, watching the snow continue to fall. In 2 months, she would be a mother. Her child would grow up knowing the truth about their conception and their father, but they would also grow up surrounded by love, honesty, and the knowledge that their mother had fought to protect not just them, but other women who had been similarly betrayed. The betrayal that had shattered Sarah's world 6 months ago had led to discoveries and revelations that none of them could have predicted. David's lies had hidden not just infidelity, but a massive government conspiracy. Sarah's pregnancy had become not just a complication, but a catalyst for exposing the truth. As she stood there, feeling her baby move inside her, Sarah realized that walking away from David's lies without telling him about the pregnancy had been the best decision she had ever made. If she had stayed, if she had tried to work things out, she never would have discovered the truth about who he really was. She would have spent years raising a child with a man who was literally paid to lie to her. Instead, she was about to become a single mother by choice, with more resources and support than she had ever imagined possible. She had a best friend in Rebecca who understood her experience in ways no one else ever could. She had parents who loved her unconditionally and a legal team that had ensured her safety and financial security. Most importantly, she had learned that she was stronger than she had ever known. The woman who had cried over discovering her boyfriend's infidelity had become someone who could testify before Congress, face down government operatives, and build a new life from scratch. That evening, as Sarah and Rebecca sat by the fire planning the foundation they wanted to create for other women who had been deceived and manipulated, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. The worst betrayal of her life had led to the most meaningful work she could imagine. Her child would be born into a world where their mother was known not as a victim, but as someone who had turned betrayal into justice, trauma into purpose, and pain into power. The phone number she had never called, the conversation she had never had, the explanation she had never demanded from David had all led to this moment. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't confrontation or closure. Sometimes it's walking away and building something better than what you lost. As the snow continued to fall outside their mountain refuge, Sarah and Rebecca planned a future neither of them could have imagined 6 months earlier. And somewhere in a federal prison, Daniel Morrison was learning that the women he had been paid to deceive were stronger, smarter, and more resilient than anyone had given them credit for. The betrayal that was supposed to remain secret had become a national scandal. The lies that were meant to protect a covert program had exposed its existence to the world. And the pregnancy that could have tied Sarah to her deceiver forever had instead become the key to her complete freedom. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful thing you can do. And sometimes the most unbelievable endings are the ones that begin with the courage to leave without looking back. "I have a friend who works as an investigative journalist," Rebecca said. "Someone who specializes in exposing government overreach. If we can get this story to the right person." Sarah thought about her parents, about the small town where she had felt safe just days earlier. If David's people were looking for her, Millbrook would be one of the first places they would search. "I need to get my parents to safety too," Sarah realized. "If they're monitoring me, my family could be in danger." As they stood in the parking lot of a diner in the middle of nowhere, two women who had been strangers a week earlier, Sarah and Rebecca realized that their lives had become intertwined in ways that went far beyond sharing the same lying boyfriend. They were now fugitives from their own government, carrying information that could expose what appeared to be an illegal surveillance program. And Sarah was pregnant with the child of a man who might not even exist. The betrayal that had started this whole nightmare was beginning to look like the least of their problems. As Sarah stared at the ultrasound image of her baby, she had no idea that the child she was carrying would soon become the center of an investigation that would expose not just David's lies, but a much larger conspiracy that neither she nor Rebecca could have imagined. Meanwhile, David was making frantic phone calls from a hotel room in a city neither Sarah nor Rebecca had ever heard him mention. He was talking to someone who clearly had authority over him, someone who was very unhappy that his cover had been blown, someone who was giving him instructions that would bring all three of their lives to a collision point that none of them could avoid. The game David had been playing was bigger than two broken hearts. And Sarah and Rebecca were about to find out just how much bigger. "You're not alone," her mother said firmly. "You have us. You have Jessica and your other friends. You have a whole support system of people who love you." "But I don't have the father," Sarah said. And for the first time since discovering David's betrayal, she started crying. Not the angry tears of yesterday, but deep, grief-filled sobs for the future she had imagined and lost. Her parents moved around the table to embrace her, and Sarah felt some of the fear and uncertainty begin to ease. She wasn't alone. She might be facing single parenthood, but she wasn't facing it without love and support. That evening, as Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she began to formulate a plan. She would stay in Millbrook for a few weeks, long enough to figure out her next steps. She would see a doctor to confirm the pregnancy and make sure everything was progressing normally. She would decide whether and when to tell David about the baby. Most importantly, she would figure out how to build a life for herself and her child that wasn't dependent on a man who had proven he couldn't be trusted. What Sarah didn't know was that her decision to disappear from David's life had already set in motion a chain of events that would lead to discoveries far more shocking than anything she had uncovered about his double life. David's attempts to find her would uncover secrets that would make his betrayal seem small in comparison, and Sarah's pregnancy would become the least surprising plot twist in a story that was about to take turns no one could have predicted. 3 states away, David was doing exactly what Sarah had expected, panicking and trying to control the situation. He had driven to her old apartment, called her job, contacted mutual friends. He had even called her parents' house, though they had politely but firmly told him that Sarah didn't want to speak with him and asked him not to call again. But David's desperation to find Sarah and explain away his lies would lead him to make mistakes. Big mistakes. The kind of mistakes that would expose truths far more dangerous than a simple case of infidelity. And those truths would eventually find their way back to Sarah, just when she thought she had escaped David's web of deception for good. As Sarah drifted off to sleep in her childhood bed, one hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach, she had no way of knowing that the man she was carrying inside her was about to become the key to unraveling a mystery that stretched far beyond her own broken heart. Eka. Sarah spent an hour staring at the woman's email address, typing and deleting messages that would expose David's lies. In the end, she decided that Rebecca deserved to know the truth, but not from her. Not like this. Instead, she printed out several of the most damning email exchanges and David's duplicate social media profiles, put them in an envelope, and addressed it to Rebecca's work address. She would mail it from her hometown after she was already gone. Sarah left her keys on the kitchen counter next to a simple note. "I know about Rebecca. Don't contact me." She didn't write anything else, didn't try to express her pain or anger or disappointment. What was the point? David had proven that words meant nothing to him, that promises and declarations of love were just tools for manipulation. She wasn't going to waste any more words on a man who had already proven he couldn't be trusted with them. She loaded her car as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the apartment complex she had called home for the past 6 months. As she drove away, she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Looking back meant second-guessing herself, meant wondering if she was overreacting, meant giving David a chance to explain away the inexplicable. The 3-hour drive to her hometown passed in a blur of highway lights and radio static. Sarah kept her mind deliberately blank, focusing only on the road ahead and the practical aspects of her escape. She would stay with her parents for a few days, then figure out her next steps. She had enough savings to be unemployed for a few months if necessary, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Her boss had always liked her work. Maybe she could negotiate a remote position or a transfer to a different office. What she couldn't plan for, couldn't prepare for, couldn't possibly anticipate was the discovery that would change everything. The discovery that would make David's betrayal seem like just the first chapter of a story that was far from over. The discovery she would make the very next morning when she woke up in her childhood bedroom and realized she was late. 2 weeks late. Sarah stared at the calendar on her phone, counting backwards, her heart sinking as she realized what her body had been trying to tell her for days. The nausea she had attributed to stress, the exhaustion she had blamed on emotional turmoil, the changes she had been too distracted to notice, suddenly, they all made perfect sense. She was pregnant, with David's child. The man she had just walked away from forever was going to be the father of her baby. As Sarah sat on the edge of her childhood bed, still wearing the clothes she had driven home in, she realized that her escape from David's lies was about to become infinitely more complicated. She wasn't just running from a broken heart anymore. She was running for two.